You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
So first, I want to welcome back to the Final Say radio program our good friend Phil Kerpen, President of American Commitment. Welcome to the show, Phil.
Hey, how's it going? It's a happy day. Menendez is finally getting arrested. So you guys have got to be as thrilled as I am.
You know, it's funny. Actually, the first one I heard that from happened to have been a Twitter post that flashed across me from you.
There you go. Well, you know, I've been following this for the whole 2-year investigation when not a lot of people have. I've been, wondering for 2 years, when's this guy finally going to get arrested? And so it's, a long time coming.
You know, I want to go, before we talk about net neutrality, I want to talk about...
It is suspicious timing, though, I got to say.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you. I mean, here you have the beginning of the week, one of the most prominent liberal Democrats who is actually standing for Bibi Netanyahu and what's right? I mean, he was playing the American commitment card, so to speak, right? It's standing up for liberty and justice and good over evil, making the president look small, and here we are at the end of the week. All of a sudden, we're going to beat you with the with the presidential stick. So timing is a little suspicious, is it not?
It's very well. I mean, I think that what's been happening. This is just conjecture. I can't prove any of this, but I think that what's been happening for the past 2 years is basically, they had the goods on this guy. They knew he was corrupt, but instead of arresting him or indicting him, they dragged out the FBI probe and the grand jury investigation, and they dragged it out to try to get leverage on him on key foreign policy matters. Remember, he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then he was the ranking member, which he is now. And so, I think that they used some leaks at strategic moments. Like last January, you noticed they leaked that the probe was widening right around the time that he was pushing for a floor vote on Iran sanctions, and then he sort of backed away from his own bill. And I think that what happened here is they were stalling this thing out to get leverage. He is guilty, in my judgment, but they were stalling this out. They could have arrested him 2 years ago if they wanted to. They were stalling this out to try to get leverage on him, to try to get him under their thumb. And to his credit, it didn't work. When it came down to it, with this terrible deal imminent, he basically said, do what you're going to do. I'm not going to back down. And at that point, they said, well, there's no point in stalling this any longer, and they went ahead and they arrested him. And I think that's my best read on what happened and why the timing looks the way it did.
Well, I think it's fairly spot on. Again, this is just conjecture. It's not our job to play prosecutor, but I think there's two interesting sides of this. First, it was the perfect time to use the stick, and they also, you got to remember, up until only a few months ago, the Democrats were in control of the Senate, and so the last thing in the world they would want to do is give, especially for how much heat he took for allowing Cory Booker to come to power the first time, the last thing they wanted to do is give Chris Christie, now contemplating being a president, another opportunity to put another senator in New Jersey. So I think it's suspicious all around, to say the least.
Yeah, but I do think they've got another problem here. The Democrats have another problem here, which is, the whole center of these charges is that in exchange for these various, corrupt gifts and lavish trips to the Dominican on the private jets and all the rest of it, Menendez went into Medicare officials and said, don't investigate my good friend Salomon Melgen, the guy who was paying for all that stuff, or Melgen, I guess, is how you're supposed to pronounce it. I just Americanized it to Melgen. I have trouble saying it the Spanish way, to be honest. Harry Reid was in the room. He was in the room when he and Menendez went in together to try to get the investigation called off. That's a big problem for Democrats. How do they explain how what Reid did was okay while Menendez is being prosecuted for the same thing? So that's another thing to watch in this.
Well, I want to make a transition to discussing net neutrality, but I want to point two things out as part of that transition. So first, remember not too long ago we had a Clinton president and we had this thing called Filegate. And this was before we had nearly the integrated networks and communication systems we have now. But it's amazing. All these FBI files disappeared, and all these people who maybe didn't have the couillons that Senator Menendez did seemed to back off of all kinds of pressure that they were willing to apply until Filegate leaked out, which made you wonder in the back of your mind, what did they have on whom? And, we saw, for example, anyway, I didn't want to compare that or add to that. Then we have the whole Hillary's going to, maintain extra governmental services, right? Remember, one of the top people in line to be president, and she's going to keep her own servers, and then throw in, the net neutrality thing, and as a transition, boy, in a world where we have net neutrality and the government in complete control of the internet, we don't even need someone like Sandy Berger to go in and shred documents to change history, do we?
Well, I think what they're talking about doing now is economic regulation of the network, and it's more than a few steps away from being able to exercise direct physical control of all the servers or anything like that. And so I'm not to say that it could never get there, but that's not what they're doing right now. But I do think, one of the reasons that I'm so concerned about what they're doing with applying economic regulation to the internet for the first time is, I think as they scare off private investment and we get forced to pay higher and higher taxes to make up for it, sort of the character of the internet is going to become more and more governmental. And what's going to happen in a few years is they'll say, well, we're paying for this 30 or 40% of the network. We're paying with tax dollars. This is a public network. It needs to be run in the public interest, and we're going to have equal time requirements, and we're going to have licensing for large websites and all this kind of thing. And once we really go down that path, you could actually foresee a scenario where government says, we're going to regulate the contents of specific servers, and it could go very, very far. And so, I'm not saying that that's right around the corner, but I am saying it's crazy to take even a single step down that path when the internet as a private free market has worked incredibly well. And so I just, this idea that we're going to start changing the incentives and putting regulations that start shifting the internet from a purely private investment competitive free market to something with a pretty heavy government hand is a huge mistake in my judgment, even if it never gets quite as far as the example you were giving.
Well, of course, now for obvious reasons, I went to the extreme because the problem you have is the minute you allow the government, look at the tax code, right? You go back to everything that the IRS was supposed to do versus what it's doing now. It is a slippery slope, and when we live in a world where government has a nearly insatiable desire to aggregate power and to influence and impact our lives in literally there's almost nothing you can do in life that isn't influenced heavily by the government. I think it's a natural slippery slope.
Yeah, I think that's right. But, I get called like a conspiracy theorist and all this kind of thing for making this argument, which is kind of funny because they won't even show us the contents of this order, which are over 300 pages. And, I say this is going to lead to all these terrible things. They say, oh, no, you're crazy. I say, well, can I see exactly what you're ordering? No, you can't. All right, I don't know.
Well, the irony of this if you had to sum up the entirety of this administration's irony in one word, I think that word would be transparency, Phil, and I think that's exactly what you're pointing out, is if it's such a wonderful thing, show it to us. Just like the healthcare law. If it's such a wonderful thing, why did we have to hide it all? And why did nobody even know what they were voting on? Even congressmen had to pass it to know what was in it.
Yeah, exactly. So I just saw a post over at Forbes today. I don't have it in front of me, but I tweeted it out earlier today. But there's a computer scientist at Berkeley who's like a big liberal who thinks the internet should be regulated, and he noticed one line in one of the fact sheets that they put out, and he said this is going to break the entire internet. And he's like, this makes me wonder what else is going to be in this thing when they finally release it. And that's from a liberal who thinks the internet should be regulated. So you got people, first of all, you've got this danger that I'm talking about where you're going to sort of shift to governmental control economically over time, and that's going to bring calls for further regulation and so forth. But then you also have this factor of these people just don't understand the computer science and the engineering that they're messing with, and so they could just break everything just out of stupidity also.
I think that's a very good point. It's not necessarily just a legal intent. I had four simple notes that were the issues I wanted to get your opinion on because you mentioned a few of them in passing, but the four basically that I see. One is it's an obvious place for the insatiable government desire to take our money and take control. So it's an obvious revenue grab, which will drive a lot of the incentive out of the innovators in the net. The second is regulation is the enemy of innovation, right? And I think that's a big problem. The other side is the return on investment. The minute government regulation by its very nature makes it very difficult for startups to raise money and successfully generate a return on investment to their investors. So I think you're scaring also away the new capital. And then the last one, which I think is a huge issue, and I'd like you to very specifically touch on, is it also, and this can sound as conspiratorial as not, but we're out there for years. We've been complaining about other governments, just as we've seen Turkey do recently, to take control of the Internet, block all these services. And we don't just see it from governments like North Korea and China and Cuba or Iran, but even countries, NATO countries like Turkey, we're seeing it from. And so if our government is basically doing the same thing we've been accusing others of doing for years, and I think that's speaks volumes for the risk that sometimes you're not paranoid. The old phrase, you may not be paranoid if they are actually trying to kill you. So maybe it's a slippery slope towards conspiratorial nature.
Well, but there's also a much more direct impact when you talk about these repressive regimes and all of their various efforts to undermine Internet freedom abroad. We've had a very aggressive diplomatic posture against those things, and that's actually been even when Hillary was at state, to her credit, I mean, she was very aggressive on trying to dial back these policies abroad. And how can we have any credibility when we're trying to do that when we're regulating the Internet in the United States at the same time? I think that we're going to be laughed at with this order in effect the next time we tell a foreign country you really shouldn't regulate the Internet. I mean, we now have zero credibility to try to argue against these regimes abroad.
Now, I can tell you very specifically. I'm on a board of it's a global effort, but it's Parisian based. I forget whether I ever mentioned this to you, but it's an effort called Forum d'Avignon, and the basic nature of this is to try to resolve the natural tension, if you will, between the need to regulate and protect people's privacy versus the need to have open innovation on the Internet, right? And that's what this is exactly doing. And so I've spent a lot of time with international players who deal with these issues, and one of the most common denominators I hear from these people is we don't trust America and we don't trust American companies because some of this is a side effect of Snowden. But even the foreign people will make comments to me like, look, we watch your government take information and use it as a weapon against American citizens. Why on earth wouldn't we expect that they will do it with us? And so we're starting from a framework of people they admire us, our technical prowess, but they don't trust us and respect us. So if we take away our the tools that created that prowess and we give them more reason not to respect us, then who will be the next Google? Where will the next Google and the next Facebook come from? They'll come from China. They'll come from Brazil or Russia, but they may not come from here if we keep it up.
Well, and sort of related to that, with the policies we've had in place in the U.S., with basically a no regulation, free market Internet policy, all of those dominant global brands have been in the United States. So one would conclude that we've been doing it right. And yet we're about to completely change the regulatory approach to the Internet that has worked so incredibly well. And that's pretty crazy also, just the sort of setting aside the international perception, the idea that we would look at, the past 10, 12 years of Internet policy in the U.S. and say, oh, that was all a mistake. Well, I mean, that's crazy. Who thinks that? And yet, that's basically what the FCC voted on party lines to do, to expressly reverse the cable modem order from 2004. I mean, that's crazy, but that's what they just did. Now,
let's go straight to the simple irony here in its entirety. If you wanted to do just like the Affordable Care Act is not it's not affordable and it's not an act. It's an insurmountable bureaucracy. But you could say the same for this. It started with 332 pages. If that's a starting point, you can only imagine throw at least a zero on the end of it. But Phil, if you look at it from this perspective, the name of the law is admirable. The idea of net neutrality from an access point is great. But Phil, couldn't you and I, over one beer, write a 2-page document that solved that equation?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, this is kind of the amazing thing here, which sort of exposed the fraud of the excuse that these Democrats are using for turning the Internet into a regulated public utility. Republicans offered a bill that did everything the Democrats claimed they wanted. They offered a bill that said no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization, and transparency of network management practices. So every principle the Democrats said they wanted, Republicans said in Congress said, you know what? we're fine with that. We'll do that legislatively, but we want to block public utility regulation. And Senator John Thune, who's the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, wrote the bill to do that. In fact, he had the ranking member of his committee, Democrat Bill Nelson, had agreed to it. They were going to move the bill forward when the White House called Bill Nelson and said, you better not even talk to the Republicans. And suddenly, there is not a single Democrat in Congress who's willing to even discuss a bill to do what they claim they wanted to do. They all are now backing what the White House had the FCC do instead. And so I think they've really been exposed as this not at all being about what they pretended it was about.
Well, and that was exactly my point. I think we have learned, if we've learned nothing from all the hard work you do at American Commitment, it's to look through even the purpose of the regulation, because very often the purpose at the book cover level might be admirable. It's the practice, it's the intent, and ultimately who's behind it, and the age-old follow the money trail. Phil, in the maybe 2 minutes we have left, are there any other specific issues you're following that you want to make our listeners aware of? And also, please let them know about your organization and how they can support the work you do.
Well, we were very active this week. I was out at the Supreme Court for the healthcare case, and we've got, I've got an article actually on the front of our website right now, AmericanCommitment.org, that sort of ties all this stuff together, because we just saw this unbelievable 7-day stretch, starting with the FCC order last Thursday and ending with the Supreme Court on Wednesday. In between, Republicans caved on the president's executive amnesty, and the president said he would use a veto to backstop the NLRB's ambush elections rule. And so we just had this really remarkable week where we were essentially told that bureaucrats could do whatever they want at the IRS, the NLRB, the FCC. It's a very chilling time, and especially if the Supreme Court gets this healthcare case wrong, they'll be saying the IRS can rewrite a law to say the opposite of what it actually says. And so I think we're at sort of a perilous moment for our country, and I just think that, sort of big picture, this is the issue we need to keep hammering on and educate our friends and neighbors and pressure our elected officials, because if the bureaucrats can rewrite the laws, then we don't have laws. And this is sort of the theme that's underlying so many of the different issues that are going on in the country right now. So that's my big focus.
I think it's terrific, and we always encourage our fans to pay attention to, support American Commitment. We're huge fans of the work that you do. We love having you on the show because you always bring just an appropriate, fair level of, as I like to say, sobriety, right? 'Cause I think that's what we need. Is we need adults in the room, and we like them to be sober at least for another couple hours. It's 3:52 Friday, so just a couple more hours of sobriety will work. So anyway, Phil, thanks so much for joining us. Have a terrific.
And I want Governor Christie to appoint our friend Steve Lonigan, but I doubt it'll happen. But if that Menendez seat opens up, he would obviously be the best pick.
I would encourage you to not hold your breath, but I think it would be a good choice. Phil, it looks like we should be getting some nice sun this weekend. Enjoy it, and we'll speak with you soon enough. Thank you.
All right, have a good one. Bye.